Hello and welcome to another episode of Your Leader Story, brought to you by, frankly, myself, Jennifer Potter. And I am very excited today because we have an unusual kind of leader on our podcast. And I'm really looking forward to delving into that. So Kate Ravilious, welcome to the podcast. And thank you so much for giving up your time to come on this podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited by the questions you're asking.
I can't wait to get into the questions. But for those people out there that don't know you, I'm just going to introduce you as you've asked me to introduce you so I'm going to read it just to make sure that I get it right, because that really matters to me. So for those people out there that don't know, this is Kate Ravilious. She is a councillor for Fulford and Heslington Ward in the City of York, and also executive member for transport at City of York Council. That's quite a mouthful for a job title.
It is a bit, really, isn't it? And it's hard when I'm explaining to people what does that mean. And essentially, it means I look out for the interests of the people in Fulford and Heslington as their councillor and elected representative. But I'm also responsible for transport decisions across the city.
And how long have you been doing that? Because it's quite an unusual leadership role in the context of leadership in a traditional perspective.
Yeah, so I was elected as a councillor 2 years ago. Initially, I was leading on the environment portfolio, so helping to make environment decisions across the city. And then 1 year ago, I was transferred into the transport department, so I took on that transport portfolio. So I've been looking after the transport decisions for the last year.
Yeah. And one of the questions, just to give the listeners a bit more context, is what was your first leadership position?
So this, being a councillor and being an executive member, is my first official leadership position where I'm officially recognised as a leader. But being invited on this podcast has really made me question what do we mean by a leader? And, is it just the people who officially have that title who are leaders? And I was thinking about my background and how I got to here. Had I done any leadership before without being called a leader necessarily? And when I thought about it, there were instances, and I think virtually everybody in their life has instances of where they lead, and those experiences build up. And then in my case, I did feel comfortable with taking on the leadership role 2 years ago, probably because of some of those other experiences which weren't formally identified as leadership.
But there were leading activities or activities that required you to demonstrate leadership behaviours, qualities,
Yeah,
skills.
yeah. So I think it's often when you feel comfortable with taking a position on something, then you naturally might start to lead. And even when I look at things like becoming a parent, and there's a necessity as a parent that you have to take leadership in terms of the decisions you make around bringing up your children. So many people in their everyday lives end up being a leader, and that is making decisions and taking a position on something. And we all do that, and the better we get at doing that and the more confidence we have in doing it, then we're all in a better position.
Yeah. So is it fair for me to say that you fall into the category of accidental leader, and that you weren't
Absolutely.
necessarily looking to be a leader?
Yeah, no, I wasn't looking to be a leader. Obviously, I did put myself forward to be an elected representative, and that came from probably a position of frustration, being a citizen of this city, York, which is a lovely city, and feeling like the city had more potential than it was achieving, and feeling like that the existing leadership were perhaps not being very strategic in their approach to how the city was being run. So therefore, in the end, I was persuaded by other leaders at that point, why not put yourself forward? Because we need, and I suppose that's the other really important thing for me, that it's very rare that it's a single person leading and making decisions. And
Yeah.
I've very much, my experience in the last 2 years has been, when you put yourself forward and say, I want to help lead, it's very much you're part of a team of people making those decisions with lots of support.
Yeah, and you were just about to finish a sentence a minute ago where you said that people in the local council said, why don't you put yourself forward because we need, and then you changed. What was the end of that sentence? I'm curious. What did they see in you that they thought they needed?
I think it's seeing somebody who's prepared to make a difficult decision that not everybody is necessarily going to agree with. And that's a crucial quality of leading, that in order to make progress and achieve positive change, sometimes it's not possible to find a compromise where everybody is content and happy at that moment in time. And you have to make a decision that you can see strategically will lead to positive outcomes, but won't necessarily have 100% agreement from everybody. And so I think because I'd been in a position of campaigning around things where I felt decisions were not being made in a good way, the other leaders that I encountered could see that I was prepared to speak out about something,
Mm,
even when I might face opposition and disagreement.
yeah. And a very important skill in your kind of leadership. Well, any kind
Yes.
of leadership, but particularly your kind of leadership.
I think when it's political leadership, then yes, you have to be willing to take a position.
Yeah. And what does the word leader mean to you? So it's really, I love the fact that you're coming from like a really non-traditional. And when I say traditional, I guess I think when people hear leader, they think of leader in industry and business and commerce.
Mhm.
But of course, there are so many ways to lead. So what does the word leader mean to you?
Um, so I think to me, it's being a figurehead for decisions. So saying this is on my I'm on my back, as it were, this decision. Um, but it's also about being able to communicate. I think that's a really crucial skill for any leader, and one that I'm certainly working hard on. That's not necessarily in my strongest skill set, and that's about being able to communicate outwardly to people why you're making this decision and what the vision is, what the strategy is. And that's often quite complex and not black and white. So I think being a leader is about being able to make difficult decisions, but being able to communicate those difficult decisions and help people understand the challenge of making the decision and the benefits of making that decision.
Mm,
um, yeah, and like I say, it happens at every level. We are all leaders, almost all of us, in our everyday lives at certain points of time, but we perhaps don't recognise that traditionally.
yeah, that's what we say, frankly, that leaders are lurking everywhere. And that actually,
Hmm.
if you gave everybody leadership skills before they left school, we'd be in a really great position as a country.
Yes, I think that's so true. Yeah.
So thinking back to when you were younger, um, I'm guessing, but I'm not going to assume, that you probably didn't dream about becoming a leader, given you've only come into it in the last couple of years and by default rather than design. So what kind of things do you imagine you were going to be doing in your career when you were older?
Yeah, so just to say, I mean, I'm 50 now, so this is very late into, and it wasn't an intended career path at all. I think I was somebody who was never really certain what I wanted to be when I was growing up. I always wanted to keep my options open, so I often sort of made decisions that kept options open. And I think I often dreamed. I had a sort of romantic idea about exploring and going to new places, and I loved reading books about those explorers
Mm.
who'd who'd completed challenges of endurance, and so perhaps I had romantic notions of that kind of life ahead of me. And then as you grow up, you sort of maybe start to realize, perhaps I don't have the skill set for this. Um, and just a reality of yeah, other things get in the way. And so yeah, I certainly didn't have any sort of ideas about being a leader. And my family background is not really, I don't have a family who ever had any political influence or ran businesses or did any sort of traditional leadership roles that I can think of particularly. So perhaps it just wasn't something that I was familiar with, or I
Yeah.
didn't know people who did that sort of role. So yeah, my background ended up being I went into doing a science degree and sort of understanding how we use science to improve people's lives, I guess. But then it was very much an accidental thing to fall into politics and this kind of leadership in my home city. And I guess that's perhaps from having lived in York for the last 18 years, and you become attached to a place and then you start to feel like you want to influence the direction in which your city is developing. So that's probably where it came from.
I hear people say that if you're not from York originally, once you move here, it's very hard to leave.
That's very
Get
true, I think.
trapped.
Yes, a lot of people, come here and don't leave. And that's interesting from the perspective that I'm in now, that I think as a city, it's perhaps different to other cities in that people are very attached to their city and really care. And that's brilliant because we have people who really care and want to volunteer and want
Mm,
to make the city better. But it also means that when we do a public consultation or want to change something, there's a lot of noise
yeah,
and interest in it.
yeah,
And so we have a really important job in being able to communicate what we're doing because people in York really care.
yeah. And making it inclusive, I imagine, as well, like making sure everyone's voices are heard.
Absolutely, because
Yeah,
it's too easy sometimes to only listen to the noisiest voices. So we have to work really hard to make sure that we are getting a real understanding of what people in York want to see.
yeah. So, is there anything that you love about being a leader?
Um, I'm not sure I would use the word love, but because I find it really challenging and I am still finding it really challenging. It's not something that has necessarily come naturally to me. But I really recognize that it's a privilege to be in this position where I can influence change. And I particularly feel that from being at the other end of the spectrum when I was campaigning around decisions and feeling very powerless,
Mm,
to now have that privilege of being able to influence. But it doesn't mean I can just do what I want. I can't.
yeah,
And there's been a lot of learning for me around how the governance process works and how decisions are made. It's been a sort of baptism of fire. But I do really appreciate that privilege and um, and the fact that I am able, with my colleagues, to actually bring about some very positive change for the city is something amazing, and I'm really glad to be part of
yeah.
that. Yeah.
There's a real sense of purpose. Like one of the things, like leaders in a kind of commercial organization, one of the things that's perhaps more of a challenge for them is making sure that they feel and find purpose in their role of leading.
Mm.
Whereas for you, it's almost like it's a given, isn't it? Like there's so much purpose with the
Mm.
role. It's then how do you find the leadership skills or the method of leading that is very inclusive and enables that purpose to have life.
Yeah, I think so. And I suppose there's always the balance between the political life cycle is you have a 4-year term, and it's working out what's feasible for us to achieve in that 4-year term before we have to start thinking about being re-elected again. And sometimes that's quite a challenge because um, many decisions and positive outcomes need longer than a 4-year term to be put into place.
Mm,
So there's, I think for us, a lot of the challenge is around working with our political opposition to find that we can enact decisions that we all politically agree with so that they do last the longer term and they're not just going to be undone the next time we have a change in political administration.
yeah.
So for us, it's perhaps more about the politics and the longevity of our decisions.
Yeah, and I imagine a lot of the public don't realise, because they don't know, just how long some of these decisions take
Mm.
to influence. So I imagine there are probably some things that you can change quite quickly locally, but then there's probably quite a lot because we're talking about societal level change, and
Yeah.
that's not a quick overnight. change the traffic light system, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been a real learning curve for me, that some of the statutory um, governance process around decision making is much slower than I would have realized from the
Yeah.
outside. And the sort of requirements around public consultation. And then of course there's the budget challenge, that we have to work with a limited, and in fact we're having to save money all the time. So with a limited budget, with limited officer capacity to sometimes do some of the more radical things that we want to do, and those governance requirements, it puts constraints on what you're able to do. And that's not to excuse that we're not doing things, but it has been a learning curve to realize that. And particularly, like you say, when it's around sort of culture change and behavioral change, which you can't just do overnight.
Yeah.
Then we've had to look at how do we break that down into manageable steps, so that what can we do in our 4-year time period, and what can we do with confidence with um, our political opposition, so that we can move forward on some of those bigger issues.
It's one of the things in my line of work when we're dealing with particularly senior leaders is that to try and encourage them to get their head around the fact that they are holding that role in that organisation for a period of time, and it's almost like you come here to do the role of, and you're caretaking it for a while, knowing that at some point inevitably you will hand that role lovingly and respectfully over to somebody else to take over and carry on with the legacy, that you just get to kind of care for the legacy for a period of time that you're in it, rather than it's about you. It's the role that you're in service of. And I
Yeah,
really like that concept here in this political context as well.
yeah, I think that's so true. And it's very important to separate your own ego from
Yes.
the leadership role that you have. And it is absolutely about caretaking it. In our case, as politicians, every year our role of leading that particular portfolio is up for review. And we can be, as I was last year, I was shifted from one portfolio to another, and we have to be ready to be moved around to make the whole system work. So being a leader is not a given. And I'm very aware that this, I certainly won't be doing it forever. And what I want to do is leave the sort of the system and the decisions that we've made in a good place for whoever takes it on
Yeah.
next.
Yeah. And so looking at it from the flip side, what do you find most challenging or hardest about being a leader?
So it has been very challenging for me. I think I'm not used to being in the limelight, and particularly with transport, there's a lot of media inquiries. So I'm often having to very publicly answer what we're doing and why to the public. And there's a lot of public interest in it, in anything we do.
Mhm.
Literally changing the timing on a traffic light junction will generate public interest, repairing potholes, all of these things. So, and I'm often invited to meetings where I'm having to speak about what we're doing publicly. So that wasn't something I did a lot of before, that sort of public speaking and thinking on my feet. And I've had to just learn a lot on the job in terms of doing that. And we have had some training as well. So that's been challenging. And the other thing for me is just the volume of emails that I receive. I think because it's a topic that's very emotive, transport, and people, no matter who you are and what you do, you need to move around. And so everybody feels it impacts them, and it does
Mm.
impact them. So I'm probably getting something like 100 emails every day. And
Wow.
there is an obligation to reply. Almost all of them need some kind of response. So I'm having to set aside quite a chunk of time each day, and that just makes it hard to have the work-life balance,
Mm.
and also to balance the sort of operational day-to-day part of the role with the strategic thinking part of the role. I'm
Mm.
trying to make sure that the operational or firefighting aspect of my job doesn't consume all my time, because it's really important that we're doing that strategic and and longer term thinking as well. And it would be too easy to just drown in the emails and never really do the strategic thinking. So I
Yeah.
find that a very difficult balance. And it's not just me. I also feel for the officers who are doing the actual hard work behind the leadership
Yeah.
aspect of it. They also are under that sort of public scrutiny and having to answer some of those emails that I will just forward on to them and say, can you answer this resident? So there is, a real challenge there around dealing with the day to day and managing to do the longer term stuff.
Yeah, and doing it, what I'm hearing is doing it diligently and with respect for everybody that's involved,
Mm,
whether they're inside your team or somebody who happens to live, a resident who lives in the city, and
mm.
by default, in some ways, they become part of your stakeholder group, don't they? That you have to be
Yeah,
accountable to.
yeah, absolutely. And it's really important to bring residents with us. If I was just to sort of take a cavalier attitude and say I'm either going to send very, very brief responses or not reply, then I think we end up with a bigger problem later where um, our residents are not engaged or understanding in the process. And
Yeah,
so it is part of it is responding to those individual emails, and some of them are all on the same theme, and I do manage to sort of say, okay, I have a bit of a stock response sometimes on when they're very similar sort of
yeah,
emails. But yeah, and I think it is really important that when I'm asked to go to a ward meeting or a parish council meeting or a particular interest group meeting, then I do my best to go, because the more we do to explain and communicate, the easier our job gets in the long run than if I let that fester, where people think, well, they come up with their own theories if we don't go and explain what we're
yeah.
doing.
So, what's the biggest lesson that you've learned about being a leader so far?
Yeah, so it has been a huge learning curve for me, to step into a role like this, and I think um, my instinctive personality is to be quite sort of quick on things, and to be fairly impulsive. And I've had to really step back some of that impulsive nature and take longer to reflect on things before making decisions, to not just do the sort of gut instinct, and to keep remembering that it's a real privilege to be in my
Mm,
position, that I don't have to fight it's adapting from being in a campaign sort of mindset where I felt like I had to fight for things, to going, actually, no, am lucky, I have this privilege. I can stop, I can reflect, I can listen to people, and we can make a better decision by, rather than me just being instinctive, I take some time, I talk to my colleagues about the decision, seek their advice, I listen to other people who have expertise or lived experience, and don't rush into making
mm,
decisions. I think all of those have been really important lessons for me, and are useful to carry forward into my life in other aspects of my life. So it's a
mm.
really valuable thing to have learnt. But like I say, a very steep learning curve.
Yeah, massively. I can echo that. So, when you're thinking to the future, what other qualities do you think leaders need to be prioritizing in their toolkit to meet the
Mm.
future that's coming?
Yeah. So I mean, I think being able to articulate and communicate why you're doing something is so vital for a leader. And perhaps communication isn't something that necessarily you necessarily think that's the most important skill for a leader to have. But in order for a leader to be successful, then that communication side of things is absolutely vital and
Mm,
perhaps overlooked. Um, and then I think the other aspects for me are that ability to assimilate evidence and data and use all of that to inform your decision. And perhaps there are not so many leaders one of the things for me is that I've come from a science background where there's a very sort of structured way of assessing a problem and gathering the data and analysing the evidence and then using that to inform a decision. And maybe when I stepped into this role, I sort of assumed everybody worked in that way, but they don't. And so that's something that's been very useful from my scientific training to apply that into the leadership role. And I feel that that would be valuable as part of leadership training. That how do you gather the evidence
Yes.
and use that evidence base to inform the decision? And certainly in political spheres, there's not as much of using that data and evidence base as I would like. So it's something that I've brought into my role, certainly.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially in this age of misinformation that we're now living. How I use the term discernment, like how do you discern from the information, the data that you've gathered, what's good and bad quality data within that so that you can move forward with greater clarity. I think it's a really important topic. It hasn't come up yet on the podcast, so I'm really glad that you've brought it because I think it is a super important quality of future leadership.
I think the other thing there is, and this where it sort of it goes together with the communication, is that there's a need, once you have assimilated that evidence, to actually myth bust. So it is
Yes.
that you have the evidence, and then social media in particular drives a number of myths, and it's really important that the leader is able to then say, we're making this decision, and here's the evidence base which it's resting upon, and this is why it's so important, and to undo some of the myths, to yeah, because they take off like wildfire.
They do. Yeah, they do. They have a life of their own.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
is there anyone that you look to for inspiration when it comes to like leadership?
So I was reflecting on this question, and because I'm sort of so new to leadership, a lot of my inspiration has come from the team that's around me, and it's really important that it's not just me on my own, and I'm very much part of a team. We have an executive board of leaders, and we each take responsibility for different portfolios. And I've learned so much from watching both my fellow executive members and my fellow councillors who chair committees and make leadership decisions at their, their ward level. There's been so much to learn from all of them. Just watching the day-to-day way in which they operate. And I suppose I'm able to learn more from them because I see them and I interact with them. And I could have quoted to you, leaders that I admire, like Obama, or watching Zelensky and the way he's leading his country. But I don't know enough about the nuts and bolts of how they became the leaders that they were and are. So I can look at them and be admiring, and I can sort of get some sense of the skills that they bring. But I think I've learnt the most from those leaders that I interact with on a daily basis, and I can really see what they're doing and learn so much from them.
I love that. I love that. And one of the things that we talk, one of the myths, going back to myths, one of the myths in leadership is very much it's about what you do to others. And one of the things I feel like I'm always banging on about in my work is, you have to put your oxygen mask on first as a leader. Like you really have to take care of you first. You need to be at your best. Like what are the conditions that you need? How do you resource yourself? So what support do you think leaders need in order for them to be able to be at their best?
Yeah, so something I'm trying my best to do, but is hard, is to put boundaries around when you're working and when you're not working. And I think it's really important that leaders are able to do this, to have genuine time where they can say somebody else is taking responsibility and I am allowed to take a break. And so I've started now to just not look at my emails at the weekend, and I have to do that in order to give myself some proper downtime. And similarly, I've started to try and say to myself, I'm not going to respond to things after 8 o'clock at night because I don't sleep properly otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's recognizing those things, and it's different for different people. So there isn't a sort of one size fits all. Some people are able to put time in at the weekend and would prefer to, and so it's really important that you're able to make those boundaries yourself, but it's so important to be able and allowed to have some genuine downtime in order to function properly and make good decisions. So I think that for me is the most important thing of all.
I love that. And if you could do any job in the world and you had your time again, what would you do?
So at this precise moment in time, this is exactly what I want to be doing, and I really do feel that it's a wonderful privilege to be able to do it. I haven't got another ambition of something else I would want to do right now, but it's not something I want to do forever either. I'm very much, this is great, and I want to do it now, and I want to be able to pass it on to somebody else and to leave the city in a better place than it was, and have confidence that it's moving forwards. So yeah, right now I feel I'm very privileged and lucky to do exactly what I'm doing right now.
Oh, how lovely. And my wildcard question, one wildcard question is, what's the question you think I need to be asking on this podcast?
So I think one of the interesting things for me, and reflecting around leadership and who is a leader, is that it's very hard, I think, to step into leadership roles when you're coming from a background where you're perhaps less familiar with it or you have less experience of it. And yet I think that lots of people have something to offer. And so I think the question is, how do we enable more people from disadvantaged or underrepresented backgrounds to take on aspects of leadership and responsibility? And it's not an easy question to answer, and it's not an overnight question to answer. And I know, for example, within our current administration, we have a policy around appointing at least 50% of our executive members as need to be women, and that's to try and raise the profile of women as leaders and ensure that we are representative of the population, where 50% of the population are women. So there are things we can do, and that's an example of positive discrimination, which has its own issues as well and isn't always a perfect answer. But I think there are some important questions to be asked around how do we make our leadership more representative of the society that it is making decisions on behalf of.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you in that question, in terms of its importance, but also its trickiness. Yeah, we're back to, I guess we're ending where we began, which is that leaders lurk everywhere, and that you don't have to be in a formal leadership position or be hungry or ambitious to be a leader in order to be demonstrating leadership behaviours in your life. And
Yeah,
I definitely echo more people stepping forward into leadership positions,
yeah, I think.
especially if there's a passionate and purpose-driven as you, Kate.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think it's helping people to recognize that actually you have the skills to be a leader. You've already done so many things which you might not have considered were leading and leadership,
Yeah.
and realizing that leading is not about being on your own, that it is a team. And I very much have a team of both officers who are giving me the sort of expert guidance, and fellow leaders who I can bounce ideas off and make decisions together with. So it's not a sort of lonely job.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you. I've absolutely really enjoyed every answer. And I can't wait to put this out into the airwaves and see what other people think too. So thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your wisdom and your courage for coming forward and having a chat with me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.